Got it. So Spencer, I just want to say, because I saw your question in the chat about integrating this across multiple, multiple parts of a class and things like that, is there's actually a pretty amazing amount of literature out there from people who've tried doing these different things. And I think you'll hear some of it in upcoming sessions and panels also. But check out our resources page, and I think you can find some things.
Is it still doing the live transcript? I can't see it on my screen anymore. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. Okay, that's an interesting experience.
What?
So I'm sharing my second desktop. I have my Zoom controls on my third desktop, and the live transcript captions are showing up on my first desktop by themselves. It's a very strange experience. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I think we should get started. Welcome everyone to the second session of this year's Mastery Grading Conference. Just a quick reminders, we are recording this webinar and we are planning to post the recordings and slides so that you can review them later. We are retaining the right to rebroadcast and distribute, and your participation in the chat, the video, the audio, etc., is your agreement to be a part of the recording. Once again, I would like to thank College Bridge for their sponsorship of this program. Bosley and I are both affiliated with College Bridge, and we will be talking a little bit more tomorrow about them and their commitment to mastery grading. So that's kind of cool. Just a quick note about the sessions today. So session 2, which is this one, is about a half an hour. It runs right into session 3 on the same link. So we'll do a transition, but you are welcome to jump at any point from session 2A to 2B, or from session 2A to 3B. So right about that half-hour time frame, we will let you know that we are switching. Then that second part, Mastery Grading in Action. Oh, 2B said the maximum number of participants had been reached. That would be 500. That shouldn't be true.
I just saw some comments coming in about that on Slack. Yeah, something interesting is happening.
All right. Hang on. Okay, I'll go check on that in a minute. It's not in webinar mode, but it should be in 500 participant meeting mode. So we will work on that. Give me 1 second to text a troubleshoot.
One of the wonders of modern technology is the chat and the Slack channel and everything all happening at once. So we live in an exciting time, people, a very exciting time.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the link that we built that one on was one of the accounts that.
Yeah, you know what? We might have misdone the link.
Interestingly, somebody has now claimed it works.
Okay. So it might have gotten rebuilt. So if you do want to go try 2B, please feel free to do so. We will not be offended, but hopefully you'll enjoy this one as well. The other one is not in webinar mode, so we'll see what happens, and we will look at that. This is one of the challenges with Zoom links and all of their limitations. Okay. So after the second part of the session, which is an hour, we're going to have a coffee break. Then we'll go into our keynote with Linda Nielsen, then another short break. And then we'll have some parallel sessions at 4:30 and then a wrap up. So that is our plan for today. So Bosley, over to you.
So in our first keynote, definitely talked about some of the issues with traditional grading. We wanted to kind of point out some of those in particular. So, why are we here? Why are we doing this work? And it really is because of all the issues of traditional grading. Some of those issues are that traditional grading is been shown over and over to be biased and very inequitable. In some cases, it can set the instructors and students up for a antagonist type relationship, which is just the opposite of what we want to have with our students. And it is billed as, or billed as this objective way of grading, but it actually has a lot of subjectivity to it. So we like to say that it's subject masquerading as objective. And then one of the big ones that early failures, have this hugely disproportionate impact to a student's grade. And, is it our jobs to get students to where they're at by the end of the course? Or do we need to do it, at this artificial, okay, we've taught the unit, so you should have only taken 2 weeks to learn this. And if you didn't, you're never going to be able to pass the class. So these early failures have just this huge impact. And then one of the big ones is that it hides a lot of information. Giving traditional point average grades hides information about the students and doesn't really communicate actual content learning. And to demonstrate this, we want to do a little quick activity. Next slide, Sharona. So here are 3 students that are learning how to pack parachutes. So they've had multiple attempts at it, and you can see in the graph the difference that the students' performances. So which student would you want to pack your parachute? See, so already almost everyone is saying B, but their averages are all the same. Like if you look at their mathematical averages, everyone got a C. But why are we wanting student B? Because student B, who struggled at first, but has shown that consistent growth and has once they got above the mastery line, has stayed above it. So this is what we mean when we say traditional grading hides information. So each one of these students have, a story that the average of 70% is not telling. Next slide.
So our general philosophy for mastery grading that we are looking at is that grades should reflect demonstrative mastery of course content, and that the grades themselves should have a positive effect on student learning. So this is the foundation of where we're going with this.
So some of the key principles of mastery grading and what makes it different than traditional grading. It's mastery is really based on these 3 key principles. First, that it centers around a clear set of learning targets for the students that are not just, standards, but they are expressly known to the students, and they are very clear from the beginning of the course. And that your assessments are based directly on those learning targets, and that we're assessing for a level of mastery. But we're focusing those assessments specifically on the learning targets that are in the course and that the assessment is supposed to be centered around. And then the big one, the one that really differs from traditional grading, is that eventual mastery matters. Again, we saw that in the parachute example. I'm sure we've all seen it in our classes. Traditionally, you teach a unit, you test on that unit, and then regardless of what happens, you move on. Okay. Someone's got a helicopter close to them. Sorry. So does it matter if a student, is can get it at the end of the unit, I mean, if they can, that's great. But should a student that needs a little bit more time, but does still eventually get there, should they be punished that they started off needing more help, that they started off needing just longer to process and understand and learn those specific skills or learning targets? So in traditional grading, they are punished for that early stuff. So it's almost, if you're taking a course that you actually need to learn something, you get punished for not already knowing it. Whereas in mastery grading, what we really focus on is that eventual mastery. It's okay if, it took Sharona, was able to master it in October, but, David, it took to November, and me, it took to the very end of the course. If we all got there and had the learning by the end, that's all that matters. So these are the three key principles that master grading is built on. We're going to talk a lot, throughout the conference, a lot about how we do these three things and how there is a lot of variety and a lot of different flavors of mastery grading, but they all come down to these three key principles. Next slide.
So we wanted to just touch on what some of the benefits that we perceive mastery grading in all of its flavors to do. The first thing that it enables students to do is what we call fail forward. So they fail an assessment of some sort, whether it's a portfolio or a quiz or whatever, but they fail, they're given feedback that actually matters, that they actually need to use, and they go forward in their learning. So it doesn't stop them. It has the opportunity to provide some autonomy for students, because there may be the opportunity, depending on how you've set things up, the chance for them to have multiple ways of showing that mastery. And maybe they have some choices they get to make. It provides more flexibility, both for the instructor and for the student, that if they have to accommodate, say, a global pandemic, or they have to duck away from a class, or that there's opportunities to recover, that you don't just get into this absolute trap. And it really does do a much more intrinsic job of promoting growth mindset, because the conversation with the student becomes, yes, correct, you failed this assessment, or you didn't show mastery, however the language is, yet. And so it's that yet that becomes built in to the structure. We've seen, both anecdotally and through some of the literature, a reduction in cheating, because when a student has become invested in their own learning, they're less likely to want to share their work with someone else, and they're less likely to want to represent someone else's work as their own. And one of the key things that we have experienced is it turns the student-teacher relationship into a partnership. So now, rather than I have this bar and I hold these points and you have to convince me, it's that there's this bar that's been set, that's clear and articulated to everybody. Let me now work with you as your coach to get you over that bar. So those are really where we're going with all of this. So this was our little, 10, 15-minute introduction to the fundamental principles. And I see that we have some questions. So Boz, do you have some specific ones that you'd like to tackle?
Give me a second to look over those questions.
Okay.
I want to pop in quick and mention that some of these questions can be really well answered in the second half of this section, where we have specific examples of mastery grading in action. And so a few of those I've marked as to be answered live, you will hear coming up.
Okay. I want to agree with you, Dave, that when we say showing mastery, we haven't said anything yet about how or how often or when. All we've really said is that early attempts at showing mastery need to not be penalized. So it needs to not stop a student in their tracks for early attempts to show it. So we haven't actually talked at all about the various examples of showing it or those kinds of things.
There is one question in the Q&A that I did want to address. So the question is, how do you balance the fact that math spirals and builds on itself? So in order to understand and learn new material, they really need to understand the old material while still allowing for students to learn at their own pace. And I completely agree that math is spiral and that it very much builds on itself. My argument would be, though, that what I've seen, especially in my high school courses, is that oftentimes the higher material makes the foundation stuff make more sense to them. That, going to the next level and, seeing how exponentials work sometimes actually ends up making linearity make a lot more sense. And this is where mastery grading really comes in, because, when that happens, when the going to the next step actually helps make the early steps make more sense and really cements that learning. So by the end, end of my Algebra 2 course when I teach it in high school, I haven't necessarily done a linear test in a very long time, but students could still have shown that they have mastered those abilities by some of the stuff that they've done with other polynomial stuff or other exponential things. So I definitely agree that math is spiral, but I don't think that the learning is necessarily linear, where you have to do one to get to the next. And that's why I think mastery grading, especially in math and in some of the fundamental math classes, is so important.
Dave, you had marked a couple of Sean's questions there.
And part of that is because I think Sean has some great questions about courses getting siloed and divided up into specific pieces. How do we address synthesis? And I just want to say, in the mastery grading and action part, I'm going to address that head on. And so I'm going to push that off for a moment and say, totally a thing we can do.
Okay, we have another good question from Lauren Nelson. Much of the conversation about mastery grading understandably seems to focus on the timeline of a traditional semester. I will be teaching on the block plan, so each course will only last 3.5 weeks. Do you know if there are any resources for instructors interested in mastery grading who teach on an accelerated schedule like this? Do any of you have experience using mastery-based grading in such a course? So this one makes me laugh a little bit because I just had a heck of a semester where I had some schools that took a traditional 15-week course. It was designed as a 15-week course, and they were required to teach it in 9. So it's not quite 3.5, but it is 9. And I think the question I would have for you, Lauren, or for you to think about is, what does it mean to master something if you have a 3.5 week time span? I mean, that's part of what we haven't yet talked about, and we'll probably show some of, is the definition of mastery is intentionally not yet defined because it's something that might be different for each faculty member for each situation. So what does mastery in 3.5 weeks look like? So I'm happy to have much more of that conversation. Because I do think you have to do your definitions very carefully. Bosley, you've taught on some of this.
I've taught on some sped up, nothing to a 3.5 week timeline. I mean, that's, I read that and I was like, wow. But actually, I think a big part of that is I'm assuming these courses aren't standalone courses, that they might be, a prereq to the next one. And if that's the case, I think the key thing is really having that communication and collaboration between those different courses, and really defining, okay, if we've got to do this in 3.5 weeks, what are the absolute essential things that the students should, they are standalone in 3.5 weeks? Wow.
So I don't think the answer is that you can't do it. I think the answer is, and I'm also seeing quite a few things in chat about, companies or standards that are tested in synthesis of material. I completely agree. When we say standards, we need to get away from traditional learning outcomes or things like the Common Core state standards in K-12. When we're talking about mastery, we're really asking, what do they need to be able to do? It's not just math content. And you're going to see in some of our examples that we do bring in things like critical thinking, problem solving, argumentation. Lauren, I'd like to know, what field are those courses in? Oh, good Lord, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, okay, so you're in math, you're at Colorado. Okay. So again, I would really take a hard look at what exactly should a student be able to do coming out of the course, whatever that is. The challenge with 3.5 weeks is time to assess and reassess. It can be done, but it definitely takes intentionality. And I would argue that, a traditional system is not going to get you there, because it's just not, they're not going to get the incentive to learn. It's absolutely going to be points grabbing. So let's go ahead and let us give some of our examples of our various kinds of courses and see if that sparks some information for you. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Oh, we've got a question from Allison. How do you handle students who have weak prerequisite backgrounds? For example, students who are in calculus, who struggle in algebra, may never fully understand limits and derivatives because of their background. Does MBG help them more than traditional grading? I know, Dave, you're going to talk about that. I'd like to comment first. Cal State, the entire California State University system in the last 2 years entirely did away with what we would call remediation. So every single student entering a California State University course as a school as a freshman is automatically allowed to place into any of the first level courses, which for us are pre-calculus, statistics, and quantitative reasoning. And what we have found is, again, like Bosley's previous comment, if they struggle in algebra, they actually may get a better chance to get it when they're working with limits, especially if we make mastery of limits the goal, because then we work with them and we support them to go back and fill in those necessary algebra skills in order to show that limits mastery. So we find that it is a better way to support them in getting those, because everything we've done to this point hasn't worked. So when it becomes about the mastery, that's when they start to get it. Dave, did you have more that you wanted to comment there?
I wanted to comment that Jason is also asking something similar about, for example, naming or drawing compounds. To reinforce what you said, right? This spirals within the course itself. These things come back. And so students get that reinforced over time. And as they have multiple opportunities, and as we're working into the material that uses those earlier standards, they have a chance to see where they are, why they matter, and and an opportunity to still be able to demonstrate their understanding of those. And so I actually find that mastery grading helps reinforce those things. Even prerequisite material. If I have a standard covering some prerequisite material, some students will have it as a freebie. Others will discover that suddenly it really matters and they have the chance to learn it instead of being permanently stuck.
And then if I may, I'd like to add a little bit onto that as well. Because I live both in the college and in the high school realm. And one of the things that we do in the high school realm is we actually call this mastery learning and grading. So we have a focus on not just changing the way that the grading is done, but also the way that the learning is done. And when it comes to these prerequisites, especially when I do this in Algebra 2, a lot of times I have students that are coming missing some of those prerequisite skills. And again, that early holes in their knowledge with traditional grading is going to kill their grade. Like they would never be able to recover. While as in mastery learning and grading, when we give them the students the opportunities, yes, that means they're going to have to do some more work. Yes, that means they're going to need to put a little bit more effort because they do have, further to go. But if they understand that, okay, just because, a week and a half into the semester, and when we're doing this, here's our review of linearity to get ready for Algebra 2, and they failed, it isn't necessarily going to kill their grade, and that they do have chances to still recover and bounce back from some of those prereq skills. It keeps them from shutting down for the rest of the semester. And I think that's the biggest thing that mastery grading and mastery learning and grading does, especially for my high school students. If nothing else, it at least gives them the hope that just because I've failed the first 2 units, my whole grade can no longer recover.
Okay, Joe asked, how does mastery grading work with IBL? And in general, how do you approach mastery grading if you do a lot of group work in your evaluations? I'm going to kick that one over to Drew.
So Joe will be talking more about this, but kind of briefly in general, I guess you just need to think very carefully about what the outcomes of your course are, right? So for the content outcomes, I don't think it's very different, right? Even if I'm doing inquiry-based learning in my linear algebra class, I want them to be able to show me how to compute a determinant or something, right? So that translates very, very straightforward. But maybe you can type in the chat if this is maybe more what you're asking about some of these other kinds of things we're trying to foster with inquiry-based learning. And that's where some things like specifications grading, I think, can be more helpful with those kinds of things. And David's going to talk a little bit about that when he gives his example. I think not necessarily particularly about inquiry-based learning, but I think the framework that David uses would apply equally well to IBL kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I'm always happy to answer questions about IBL, even if that's not the class I described.
The other thing I would say is one thing that we've noticed is mastery grading actually tends to lead to IBL and active learning. And you may have already said this, Drew, I apologize. I was monitoring the chat. But when a student really needs and asks to grapple with something, you find yourself wanting to leave time and make space for that in the classroom for them to grapple with other students who are still grappling. So the other thing that is kind of interesting is it also doesn't have to. So if you have colleagues who've been extremely resistant to IBL and active learning, this actually is a little bit of a gateway drug to get them into that. You can actually maybe get them there because you don't have to abandon traditional teaching practices, but you naturally tend to once you transition into mastery grading.
I think that goes back to my point I was making at the very opening, was that it's more about this underlying philosophy than any of the particular details. And once you adopt that underlying philosophy, that also causes you to shift, from a lecture-based kind of pedagogy to a student-centered learning.
And I want to add in, I actually had the sort of opposite direction. I came from a pretty heavily inquiry-based undergraduate program, and so started using that in my own teaching, and then decided my assessments are not in line with what I'm doing here in using inquiry-based learning. And I want to find a better way to do this assessment as well. And so that sort of drove me in the direction of using this type of grading. So it can go both directions there. IBL, since I see that in the chat, means inquiry-based learning. So learning in which student inquiry is centered. Students have the opportunity to ask questions where we encourage students to help develop their understanding of their own things in class.
So we are at about the half-an-hour mark. So what I'd like to do is transition us into our examples, and then we will continue to put questions in the Q&A. And we'll have another answer time after. So we are switching over to our mastery grading in action, which is going to be all of us sort of sharing our basic ones. Or, you can always check over, we did fix the issue with 2B and 3B, and we're going to keep going. So Dave, over to you.
All right, welcome to the Master Grading in Action session. So many of your questions are have been about things you will see at least examples for here, where several of us are going to give concrete examples of how we run our courses using different types of mastery grading. So next slide, please here. We're going to run through the usual things you need to know about. We're still recording this.
Actually, I should probably stop recording it and start a new recording. So give me a second.
Perfect.
How did I say that? So I'm actually going to stop this recording.